Hello, and welcome to the Shifting Culture podcast, in which we have conversations about the culture we create and the impact we can make. We long to see the body of Christ look like Jesus. I'm your host, Joshua Johnson. Go to shiftingculturepodcast.com to interact and donate. And don't forget to hit the follow button on your favorite podcast app to be notified when new episodes come out each Tuesday. And go right now and leave a 5-star rating and review. Just go to the show page on the app you are using right now and hit 5 stars. It only takes a second, and it helps us find new listeners. Thank you so much. Previous guests on the show have included Jen Pollock-Michelle, David Zoll, and Andrew Arndt. You could go back, listen to those episodes, and more. But today's guest is Ashley Hales. Ashley Hales holds a PhD in English literature from the University of Edinburgh, Scotland. With her husband, she is the co-founder of the Willowbrae Institute, a new think tank researching the intersection of Christianity and the common good in America. She is a Kirby Lang Center academic fellow and advisor to the board of Covenant College. Ashley hosts the Cartographers podcast and is the author of Finding Holy in the Suburbs and A Spacious Life. We have a great conversation about having a more spacious life. Ashley helps us see that our limits are good and points us to God. She shares spiritual practices that help notice God in everyday life, to remind ourselves that we are His beloved children, and to move from the cerebral to the rest of the body. She also talks about how to have hope in suffering and helps us navigate the cultural landscape we find ourselves in. It's a really good conversation. I know you're going to enjoy it. So here's my conversation with Ashley Hales. Ashley, welcome to the podcast. I'm really excited to have you on. Thank you so much for joining me.
You are so welcome. It's such a pleasure to be with you, Joshua.
Yeah, I'm really excited to dig deep into a space where we could find, I think, God in the midst of our everyday, and we could see where He's at and see how we could interact with Him in places, of limits, like you wrote in A Spacious Life, or interact in the world and seeing where He's at. So I'd love for you just to give us briefly a little bit of your journey into a place of trying to figure out what a spacious life looks like, and why you got to that place of saying, I want to embrace my limits and not fight against them.
Yeah. I think for a lot of us, when we're kind of hit with our human limits, whether it's limits of our season or our bodies or attention or calling, work limits, there's so many different ways we can kind of come at that question. But a lot of us tend to fight it. And a lot of us tend to kind of freeze and just go, kind of resign ourselves. I guess this is the way it is. And so for a lot of times, I often say that A Spacious Life, the book about limits, really came about from a place of frustration and anger. And so the sense that, I had been told growing up in the 80s and 90s that you can be everything you want to be, and that, you can go change the world for God. And all of these grand idealistic things, of course, came crashing down with the reality of work and relationships. And my husband and I have 4 children. So I hit my limit real quick. And it was really through that process of walking with Jesus through those limits, particularly for me with parenting. I tended to be a very cerebral person. I still am. And being a mom to 4 children made me kind of put some of that aside, at least for a season, because I had to change diapers and people needed to eat. So I think it's good to realize, I think, on the other end of that, my children are in school and teenagers. And again, of course, I still see my limits, right? That I can't control them. I don't know their stories. I can't help. I can't make the path easy for them. And part of that, hitting those limits, is how God changes us and grows us. And so I think through that process, I've become to see, as I dug into scripture, to say limits are actually good. Limits are in creation. They're actually there before sin is, right? We have planets have orbits, and we have seasons embedded in the earth, and all of those things show us that is actually the created way to live.
And I think, we've hit that as well. My story is, my wife and I were in the Middle East for 5 years. We were without a child, and we were able to
Mm-hmm.
do a lot of work and ministry and felt really good about spending our days with refugees and seeing people come to know Jesus. And we moved back to the States now 6 years ago and had our first child, and it felt like things slowed down and there was a limit. And we felt like, oh, are we doing, see, this is the thing. Am I doing enough? Is God pleased with me in the place where I train and coach people that go out and do the stuff, but am I doing it? And what am I doing with my limits? So as you started to get angry and frustrated with the place of like, hey, there's some limits, how did you start to find God in the midst of those limits, and not continue to be frustrated about the things that you couldn't control?
Right. I think I began to realize that it's all just like pick your elevator, pick your moving walkway. And, whether it's parenting, whether it's career frustrations, whether it's frustrations with your body or mental health, whether it's, even just where you are spiritually, there's so many ways in which if like maybe we get kind of the lid tamped down on one and then we move on to the next one, and you realize they're all the same thing. They're all ways in which I'm trying to find my ultimate satisfaction other than as a child of Jesus. And maybe that there's something actually good, in here. And so as I studied the life of Jesus a little bit more thoroughly with that angle, I began to see, like Jesus shows us actually how to live a good human life. And it's not just like of course he is fully God, but he's also fully human. And so he shows us how to be human. And I think there's so much in the world, whether it's technology, whether it's our own sinful desires, whether it's just kind of modern Western life that says you need to be crushing it. And if you're not crushing it, like something's wrong with you and you better be crushing it, or feel ashamed and numb out because you're not crushing it. So I think I just kept trying to dig into the biblical story and say, this is actually where God says we need to find life. So, hey, let's try it on.
So then if Jesus teaches us in his human life how to be human, and he was the one as a fully human God, which is the most unfathomable, coolest thing, that God would become human, like one of us, and walk among us and show us how to live and show us who God is. So as he has the Holy Spirit and is empowering him into life, what are some of the things that you noticed in his life that could translate into ours?
Yeah. I think one thing I love as you read through the Gospels and you're thinking about limits is obviously we all are in one place and in one point of time. And what's interesting about our modern day and age, right, is that often, like the internet, for instance, gives us this illusion of godlike control. Like we can be conversing with someone in Australia, and then we can be commenting on someone's article that they wrote about Sudan, all in the same space and time. And it flattens space, it flattens time, and it kind of gives us this sense that we can be like disembodied brains on a stick everywhere at once, godlike creatures, which is alluring, which we see Jesus deal with kind of directly, not with technology, but those same temptations in the wilderness. And again, he comes back right to the word of God, that this is the story that makes sense of my story. And we also see him throughout the Gospels stopping, right? He stops he's walking, first of all, right? He's not in a jet. He's walking, so he's going slow. So he's actually able to pay attention to people. And he's able to use even the natural world around for his parables. He's interruptible. Often he's going one way and someone says, hey, would you go heal my son or whatever? And he stops and pays attention to them. And I think there's so much that we lose about how the Spirit might be calling us to act and work because of our pace, right? Because we choose busyness over what God might want to do with us in any particular day or moment. So those are just a few things that I found, that there was a sense in which he embraced being a person in a body, in a place, in a time. And then he also paid attention to people. And then when he was presented with the allure of limitless power or even comfort, that again and again he chose the bigger story of the gospel.
Yeah, and we are living a part in that bigger story, that we often think about our own story, and that we are gods of our own story. If we're,
Right.
I mean, we don't say those words, but we act like we are gods in our own story, but we're actually living in God's story. It's a bigger story that we get to play a part of. And when you were sharing some of that, as we're flattening out time and space, it actually reminded me a little of the end of Wall-E, that Pixar movie where at the very end, there's just a bunch of, we find that there are humans. It's not just robots roaming the earth, but there are humans in a spaceship that are just stuck on a screen, and they are so fat they can't move, because they've actually entered into a different space of this isn't my place anymore. My place is everywhere. And so that's an interesting place where, Pixar told us where we're going to go if we stay in that trajectory, right?
Yeah.
So how do we make our place small but significant? And we know that we are embodied and we're here and we're in the moment, and we're not saying we're everywhere all at once.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'd love to hear your answer too. Because I think it sounds like you also, right, are figuring out how do we live the small life? How do we live the given life without, and how do we kind of attach that anchor, right, to the bigger story of our small lives? I think a lot of it has to do with various personal and corporate rhythms. So, whether it's silence and solitude as a place to experience the presence of God in a daily way, just like Bible reading, going to church, like those really boring spiritual disciplines. But they frame us, they hem our story into something bigger, that we are a part of something, and we are part of a people, and we're a part of a place. I find often, just for me, like daily walks becoming increasingly important, either with a friend or just out in nature, to pay attention to my place, to remind myself I'm not in my head all the time, or I'm not what I read or what I do. And so like moving my body for me is an antidote to getting out of my head often, which is where I can get stuck. So finding those natural sort of rhythms that push against maybe our proclivities is a good way to start. What would you say?
Well, I think those physical practices are really important. And it's important to be connected within a community, a local community. This is just the problem with my job and my sphere, is that we have a translocal community that we are encountering and interacting with, and training and coaching and making and caring for people that are all over the world and translocal. So we have this bond, but it's not a bond it's different. That I have to remind myself that there is something for me local. And that's why I really love being a part of my church body at home. And because we, as we're in homes together, as we're eating together, I'm actually able to connect to somebody and say, oh, there's people here that I'm connected with. It helps me to know, like, hey, my son, as he plays in the street and he gathers all of the other kids on the street, it's important to know that I'm a part of this community on the street. And I get to know that the other kids and the parents and the grandparents and everybody else on the street, and saying, this is our place. And so again, it's like, we need speed bumps on our road. So we're going to say, hey, let's do something for our community. So especially for me and my wife, when we are actually, we raise our eyes up and we look around the world, we have to really say, I need to get involved here on my street, on my road, say, this is part of who I am.
Mm-hmm.
And if I don't do that, then I do feel disembodied, and I feel like I don't have a place, and I'm always yearning for what's next instead of living for what is in front of me. And so that's the place that is hard to get to, especially when you're thinking about the rest of the world and have people out there in the rest of the world.
Right. Yeah. And that's a valuable space. And I think you're right that you need both, right? You need both the larger ideas and connections, right? And then you need a really specific way in which you can practice some of those things yourself. Yeah. I hear that.
It's true. It's true. As you say, what are the things that you particularly practice to have a more embodied faith than a more cerebral faith, as it goes from the head to the rest of your body?
Yeah. I tend to practice just silence and solitude as a spiritual discipline before I read my Bible and pray. And so that just involves sitting in a chair in silence, your feet on the ground, and it just to practice saying I'm actually here right now. I'm not just reading the Bible to see what great nugget I can get out of it to help me be more productive and busy and do big things for God. But just, to kind of start in a posture of humility of, I don't have life figured out. I come receiving, I come in humility. And often when you practice silence, it can, just to practice saying, I am in God's presence. I am his beloved child. Yeah, he might speak to me, but it might just be quiet. I might start reciting my, grocery list or all the emails I need to return. And all of that's okay, in the same way that as a parent would do with his or her kid that wants to tell them all about their day. It's not like you're well, that is ridiculous. You should not share that with me, right? So it is kind of a posture of remembering that I'm a kid. I'm God's kid too, and he takes great delight in me. And so that's one practice. Often, like I was saying, walking, kind of meditative prayers. I'll listen to the Pray As You Go app as a way, or even just scripture reading as I'm walking. That's another way to kind of process the Bible. And so it doesn't feel like, hey, here I am sitting here with all these commentaries and I'm just studying the Bible to get something out of it. So those are some kind of embodied practices. Obviously, there's lots of bodily movement built into the Sunday worship service. I think those are some good starters. And just thinking about having people over, we tend to practice hospitality a whole lot. It's important to our family, and we believe the call of every Christian, and so, thinking as you're cooking, either for your own family or for neighboring families, to be thoughtful about these people coming into your home as you're chopping vegetables. Those are practices of faith too.
Yeah, they are. In this conversation already, you've come back to this place and of calling yourself as a beloved child of God. And it feels like that is a primary identity. Why is that important to realize that is who we are?
I mean, I think I struggle with it a lot because I'd much rather often feel like I am special and unique. I'm Enneagram 4 with a 3-wing, which is nutso. And so it means basically I want to be the most productive, special, unique person.
Well, I'm a 3 with a 4-wing. So
okay, so you get it. So sorry, listeners, if you're not familiar with the Enneagram, but basically, I think I've always wanted to either prove myself by what I've done, or I have wanted to be seen and understood amongst people and connected. And no person can really ever give that to you. And so it's either we keep chasing accolades and outlets of praise, or we begin through humility and suffering often to realize that those things are pretty empty. And so I would say, through the last, I don't know, 5-6 years, just a various sets of challenges in our ministry life. My husband's a pastor, or feeling abandoned by people, or feeling confused about where to go next, and not really having any direct answers. And all you can do is just kind of hold on and stay put, even when you'd rather leave. Like those sorts of long periods of either confusion or suffering or bafflement, I think, have brought us back into a sense of we can really only minister and love people out of who we are. And if who we are is really always trying to kind of jockey for position, we're not actually loving God or our neighbor. And unfortunately, a lot of that has to happen through pain. I wish it were another way. But...
I know. But pain does something to us. And I think one of the things is the problem is we follow Jesus, who is a suffering servant, and he goes through the most horrific pain that any human will ever go through, and that we get to suffer with him and go through pain. But it also, I think it reminds us that we're dependent on God, and that there is an end to ourselves. And suffering means that I can't control everything. And just to be honest, the people that I know that have the most joy and know that God is faithful more than anybody else are people that have gone through enormous pain, and they've seen God's faithfulness through it. As I know that there are probably lots of people that are going through pain and they're suffering now, that they have mental anguish and have despair and anxiety and all sorts of different career pain and pain of like what is next, where we're going. How do we have hope in the midst of that despair, and how do we stay and remind ourselves that God is faithful when we can't see any light yet moving forward?
Well, I don't think you can ever do it alone. Like we can, and I don't think we can ever like reason our way out of despair, or think our way out of despair. I think it seems, at least in my experience, it's walking through those valleys of the shadow of death with other committed Christians who will not run away from you in your pain or suffering. That will welcome you to sit with them. That is where you find your Enneagram 4s who are happy to sit with you in darkness. But I think it's finding those people, because I don't ever think we can do it alone, right? That we're created for community, so we have to be able to do it with others who will kind of lift up our arms, so to speak, when we can't do it ourselves. And trusting, right, that we have, that there is something on the other side, that, if the cross-shaped life that we're invited to does lead to death, like Jesus, it also will lead to resurrection, whether that's in a month or a week or at the end of time. And so I think we just keep rehearsing the story with people who will hold us.
So what is that? What are some of the elements of that story? If you're sitting in despair, how do you rehearse the story? What are some of those elements?
Well, I will also say Alan Noble is a friend of mine, and he just is coming out with a book called On Getting Out of Bed, which really deals with the problem of life, and it kind of addresses mental health as well. But the idea that why do we get out of bed every day? How do we go? How do we, in the face of despair and evil and suffering, how do we get out of bed? So that's a short, nice little book you could read in one afternoon that just reminds us of the goodness of living. But, what do we do practically besides picking up Alan's book, let's say? Obviously, there's lots of different sorts of afflictions, but if this is just your average dark night of the soul that most Christians will experience at some point, I always encourage folks to find what brings them delight, and practice that as a spiritual practice. And then asking people for that maybe those people who are walking alongside of you, like, could you just bring me a spaghetti dinner? Or can we go out and get the sunshine on our face together? I'm always amazed at when the weather changes, how everybody's lightens a lot. Yeah. So sometimes it might be as simple as like going for a walk and drinking water and getting sunshine on your face where you'll be able to practice some way out of those moments of despair. But rehearsing that story, I think, is just, finding those little pockets of delight, maybe even those beginning inklings, what attracted you to Jesus in the first place, or a worship song, or those sorts of rays of light that you can come back to that are particular to each person.
One of the things you've been talking about is our dependence on others, our dependence on God. So we're in community and we're in a relationship with God. I think in in the Western culture, we're very much independent, right? Where hey, I can get this done, I can do it, and just as somebody that's trying to empower others to get jobs done, a lot of times I say, well, why don't I just do it? Because I can do it much better and faster. It takes more work to empower somebody else to do it. But so how do we shift our mind to say that we are not just independent creatures? And how do we change our culture and the way that we think and the way that we've been growing up and the way that the society says, pull yourself up by your bootstraps and move forward, and then enter into something that's countercultural and say, I'm dependent on my neighbor and my community?
Yeah. I wish I had the answer to that question. If only we're do these 3 steps and then the next generation will have it sorted. No, I think, I think we have to first begin to say the right no's so we can say the right yeses. So and everything has to start local, as we were talking about. So maybe it's like you could start with your own dinner table and to think about, how often do you gather around that dinner table? What is the quality of that meal? Who's invited? Can we invite some more people in? As a way to begin to think about our lives as not just belonging to ourselves, and how are our meals somehow pointing to the goodness of Jesus and his coming kingdom where all things will be made right. And it doesn't have to be fancy, it can still be your box of mac and cheese. But like, how are we paying attention to small details around our own dining tables? Might be an easy place to start that doesn't feel as big as like changing the entire culture. But, like it might be something like a book club, right? Getting folks who are interested about these questions and conversations that are in your church or neighborhood together, right? To talk about them and say, what's going on? What do you notice from your vantage point? Because your vantage point is going to be different. You're coming from a different place than me. That might be a way forward. That's something small and practical that listeners might find valuable. I'm thinking about doing something like that for like just a book club at our church for just the summer to think about some of these questions. I think a lot of it, so it's got to be that we're inviting other people in to have these sorts of discussions. It's got to be that we're saying no to certain things that are going to form us. So whether that's fighting on social media, whether it's just the rat race of production, whether it's, that your kid has to be involved in 20 extracurriculars, and you can actually, you don't have to say yes to those. I remember at one point someone told my husband, if your kid doesn't do club soccer by age 5, they're behind. And my husband goes, behind what? And she just looked at him like he had 2 heads, because the idea is, well, of course they're behind, but we don't even know really what they are behind, right? Yeah. But we keep doing more because we think that more options is going to be a better life. So choosing to say the right no's, whether that's on your calendar, or even in, whether it's extracurriculars or whatnot for those who have children, might be some few practical starting places that we hope will have ripples throughout God's kingdom. I do try to remind myself, Jesus's parable of the seeds and falling on different types of soils. And we just don't know what will actually reap a harvest, or something that looks really small this side of eternity might actually be pretty big on the other side. So that helps me when it feels like small doesn't matter too.
Yeah. And Paul said that I planted, Apollos watered, and God is the one who produces the growth. And so that's our job is to sow seeds and be faithful with what we have been entrusted with. And our job is not the fruit, and God is going to produce that harvest, which is it's very comforting to me knowing that it's not all on my shoulders. But sure. I do have to be faithful in walking those things. And I think a couple of those practices and options of gathering people on a dinner table, book club, do something to invite people in. I think as we start to practice and the people around us are practicing those same things, I think shared practice changes the way that we think and changes the way that we know the world works. If we have a practice where it's all dependent on me, I'm going to assume that the world works that way. All of the pressure is going to be on my shoulders. I'm going to bear all the responsibility. I'm not going to be yoked with Jesus. This burden isn't going to be light in my life. So we have to change our practice to be able to, I think, change the way that we think so that we can move into a new way. And I think Western culture specifically likes to say, hey, if I could know the right information, I'm going to change. Hey, I've known the right information about sugar for a long time. And it hasn't changed me yet. So it's like, hey, can I just get rid of it all? And so my practice is going to change. I don't know.
No.
What do you think? Is that something, as I'm processing that, do you think that is some of the ways that we can change and we can move forward together?
I think I love Dallas Willard talks about change happening through vision, intention, and methodology, basically. That we have to have a sense of where we're going. We have to actually intend to get there, and then a way to get there. And I think a lot of us, we might have a great vision, whether it's like to, help out at our local school, or it's to preach the gospel to a particular people group, or if it's to get rid of the sugar, right? We have a vision, but like, do we actually intend to go there? Or like, no, it's much more fun to just binge on the Easter jelly beans that are around the house. And so processing that, do I have a vision? Is it from God? From his word? Do I actually intend to go there with other people and through the power of the Spirit? And then how might I begin? What might that next step be? I think it kind of puts the pressure off of some of these bigger change questions, but I think you're exactly right. Change never happens through pure information.
Yeah. And I don't know. That's hard. I wish it just came from pure information. As a learner, I want to download it and say, I know this information, but now I have to live this information. Community is really important.
Yes.
To be able to do that. One of the things that I love is your podcast you host now, and now you brought your husband in, that you've changed the name to the Cartographers. You're looking at culture and the cultural map of where we're going. As you've started to look at those things, what are some of the things that you have been struck by, have been starting to process and learn as you've had different guests on?
I think in the Cartographers, we're really hoping to map for 21st century Christian leaders a pathway through the culture wars. I think as we've done some research with our think tank, Willowbrae Institute, we're also just seeing how, from the 90s on, this weird kind of overlap of American evangelicalism, this sense of increased prosperity amongst the United States, this sense of Christianity being tied to a particular political party, that, and through just the American history of revivalism and so many things, and kind of bootstrap frontier mentalities that have really shifted how we live out our Christian faith. We don't really look like an exilic people, which God's people have historically always been. And so I'm so curious, as we're hosting conversations on the cartographers, to get folks who have a lot more wisdom and knowledge than me to begin to weigh into some of those questions. What does it look like now? I feel like post-pandemic, I don't know if we're even post-pandemic, but it definitely was a watershed moment globally, of course. But it probably, many people talk about it as apocalyptic, right? It revealed something. It's not like it changed anything, but it probably sped up some of those cultural shifts, where we really have come to term with the limits of our power. And some folks are doubling down on that, whether that's political power or AI, or let's follow Elon Musk to Mars, whatever venue we might have for attaining control and power in our lives. But I'm really excited to continue those conversations. We're going to start a series soon on the culture wars, and talk with some folks who have been in politics for a long time, and in seminary administrators, so people who are on the ground and thinking about trends within American Christianity. I'm really excited to get some more thoughts there. Yeah.
Well, is there a way forward then within the culture and the culture wars? For, to be honest, the beginning of the pandemic, because it was so apocalyptic, that it revealed so much unhealth of the church, and so much, these power dynamics that were happening, and we're trying to manipulate things from here. And it wasn't really centered on Jesus of hey, we're going to follow this man, this God, and in the midst of it. But it was veiled. And so it's unveiled now. But now I actually have a lot of hope for the church, and a lot of things. And we see some people doubling down, like you said, we want more power. We're trying to keep hold of it. But I see a lot of people opening their hands and say, okay, I'm willing to follow you, Jesus. And we want to be the exilic people in the past. I mean, I'll give you an example from our church, Nava Church in Kansas City. A year before the pandemic, we heard from Jesus. He said, get rid of the building and start to roam the city. And so we gathered in home churches twice a month, and then other 2 times a month we would be at different churches in the afternoon gathering corporately. And once the pandemic hit, we were already in home churches. We were already there in the home, and we were continuing to follow Jesus. And there was all sorts of things of words, and our journey was a follow the cloud journey, like the Israelites in the wilderness, and we were just following Jesus wherever he's going in the city. And so I had hope, for my church, oh, there are people that do hear Jesus in the midst of these things and able to follow them. What are some of the places that you now are having these conversations? What are some of the places where you're seeing hope that there is a new way and a better way and a way forward through these culture wars?
I'm really encouraged about the ways in which Christians are increasingly able to work across difference, that in the past, either denominationally, let's say. I was just reading David Platt's new book, and he just mentioned, I just found one thing really helpful in his introduction, and he was talking about different buckets. And he said, the first bucket is the gospel, right? Was he fully God, fully man? Did he rise from the dead? And was his death, an atonement for sin? Yes. And then there's secondary buckets about baptism or, roles in ministry. And then there's tertiary buckets that are even more specific than that. And I think a lot of folks maybe in those secondary buckets are beginning, that maybe we worship differently or have different understandings about the gift of the Spirit or baptism or whatever, are actually able to come together and work together because of this kind of apocalyptic unveiling. And that's been so encouraging to me to see folks who love Jesus, they love his church, they have a passion to communicate the gospel in ways that make sense to our culture, and not sense as in like it makes sense and I agree with it, but that they're trying to be kind of missionally minded and culturally sensitive. And so I'm really encouraged, I think, about that partnership working across kind of denominational lines for and that there's a sense in which I think those folks realize this is likely a period of pruning for the American church, and that is good and healthy and necessary. And so we need to work together. So that's encouraging.
Yeah, I find that very encouraging too. And, one of the things that we use is we're training missionaries as we're talking about what are the levels of authority as we're helping new followers of Jesus. And we say the commands of Christ is the top level of authority. And we want people to be able to obey them and walk in them and live in the commands of Christ. The second level is like New Testament practices, the way that they did it through Acts and different things. And then the third is human tradition. And so I think if we like human tradition is like, oh, my denomination does it this way and we meet at this time or, whatever it is, if we have those like, hey, we could actually say this top level is our authority and we all agree like, hey, this is what we're trying to accomplish and follow, then I think we can start to work together, right? Like it's not really, our authority isn't just our tradition. It's actually, there's a higher authority, which is Jesus. And then we can go across denominations and work together, and even across Protestant and Catholic lines, we could work together and say, we're
amazing
together. It's not amazing.
Right. I think that's what Jesus prayed towards the end of his life, right? That we would be united like he and the Father. And here we are.
Yes.
Splinters.
Yes. So if you could leave the audience with anything, an encouraging word to say, hey, these are some of the steps that we could move forward in. What would you want to say to the audience?
Yeah. I would just love to remind who are listening that your limits are actually good. I think so often we fight against them or we just kind of flop underneath them, but that they're built into the fabric of creation, and that they're good guardrails, just like we need guardrails on the side of the road, we need lane lines, we need speed limits. Those are things designed to keep us safe and actually flourishing. And so when you hit those limits, it isn't that you've done something wrong or that you haven't achieved something, but that they can actually be a way to know God and to make him known and to love our neighbor. And so I think to press into those limits is part of the practice of our time, is to press in, to pray through them. God can take you kicking and screaming against them, when it comes down to it. But to go with others to love him and to say, oh, this might be actually an opportunity and not the end of the lane, is just a really encouraging thought, at least for me.
Good. I have a couple questions at the end. One, if you could go back to your 21-year-old self, what advice would you give?
Chill out. I was engaged when I was 21 to my husband, who's fantastic, and I'm glad we got married. But it was like, and I was traveling, studying overseas, and I just kind of thought like every decision is like the end of the world and such a big deal. So I would tell myself, chill out. God's got your story. Go with it.
That's really good advice. That's really good advice.
I don't know if my children will love that, but if I chill out.
Yeah. Anything you've been reading, watching lately you could recommend?
We're watching a show called New Amsterdam on Netflix, my husband and I. It's about a public hospital. And one of his friends, another pastor, mentioned like, hey, if you think about the hospital, like the church, it's pretty powerful. So and it's a good show. So there are like bloody, gory bits, where they're doing surgeries, but I've enjoyed that show. And reading, I'm currently reading Alan Noble's book on getting out of bed, and I just finished reading 2 novels because we were on vacation. So I read Eleanor Oliphant is Completely Fine, about a slightly neurotic woman, and the Thursday Murder Club series, which is about these kind of geriatrics in Britain who solve murders. It's fun and funny. So there you are.
That's awesome. I love that.
Yeah.
I think people need some of that fun and funny,
right.
and that we need to enter into that and not just get heavy reading all the time. We need a break from that too.
Yes.
So,
yes.
That's awesome. I love it. Ashley, I really appreciated this conversation. Thank you for sitting down and having that with me, of talking through what it looks like to embrace our limits and to have this space where we can find God in the particular place that we're at, that we could have a more embodied faith, that we could move from the head into our practice and what we're doing, that we could be connected with community and with God, that we could say, I am dependent on others, not just independent of myself. And then figuring out, hey, is there a way forward in these culture wars as we move forward? So, Ashley, thank you for this conversation. I loved it. And so
you are so
I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, bye. Thank you for listening to the show today. If you're really enjoying the show, please don't forget to hit the follow button on your favorite podcast app. You could do it right now. Just hit that little plus. And then I would love it if you would leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. So you could go right now to the show and leave a star rating and review, and let us know how you are enjoying the show. And find us on Facebook and Instagram. So if you want to connect, interact, I post a lot of quotes and different things that you could actually interact with the episodes, and let me know how you are enjoying the show. If you feel inclined to donate, there is a support the show link in the show notes, and it would send you directly to a page where you could donate so that new episodes can be produced for your enjoyment. So thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have an incredible week.